Welcome to Moon's Fairy Tales. Today, we delve into the chilling world of the frozen throne of Westeros. What if Arya Stark failed to kill the Night King? What if he took control of Bran Stark's body and unleashed an unstoppable winter upon the realm? Join us as we witness the fall of Dragonstone, the final stand at King's Landing, and the reign of an eternal night. Prepare yourself for a tale of ice, despair, and the fall of heroes, as the fate of Westeros hangs in the balance. Sit back, relax, and let the cold winds of the north pull you in. The Frozen Throne of Westeros. Chapter 1, A Failed Strike. The chill of the northern wind howled through the trees of the Godswood, carrying with it the scent of snow and death. Arya Stark crouched low, hidden in the shadows beneath the heart tree. Her breath was slow, her mind clear, her hand firm on the Valyrian steel dagger, the same blade she had used to cut the throats of many enemies. But this enemy was not like any she had faced before. The Night King stood only a few paces away, his frozen blue eyes scanning the darkness. His aura was suffocating, a palpable cold that seemed to drain the warmth from the very air around him. His silent army of the dead awaited his command, still as statues, their lifeless eyes fixated on the grove. They were too many, too powerful, and time was running out. Arya's heart raced. She had trained for this moment. She was the girl with no name, the faceless assassin, the weapon forged in the fires of vengeance. Yet now, facing the embodiment of death itself, doubt crept into her mind. This is my only chance, she thought. She moved swiftly, faster than the eye could follow, a blur in the moonlit night. Her dagger raised high, she lunged aiming for the precise spot, just beneath the Night King's armor. But in that moment, something shifted. The Night King turned, almost lazily, his hand outstretched, and caught Arya midair. A cold, iron grip locked around her throat, lifting her off the ground. Her dagger fell from her hand, clattering to the frozen earth below. Arya struggled, kicking, gasping for air, but the Night King's strength was insurmountable. His eyes bored into hers, a silent promise of death. No. Jon Snow's voice roared through the night as he charged toward them, longclaw in hand. But he was too far. Too late. The Night King gave no expression, no indication of triumph or cruelty. Only cold indifference as he twisted Arya's neck in a single motion. The crack echoed in the stillness of the Godswood. Jon reached them just in time to see Arya's body fall lifeless to the ground. His heart shattered, the horror of her death freezing him in place. But the Night King had no interest in Jon, not yet. Instead, his attention turned to Bran Stark, seated beneath the heart tree, his vacant eyes seeing all and nothing. The Night King strode toward him, the ancient magic of the three-eyed raven pulsing through the air. Bran's mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. His fate was sealed. With a single touch, the Night King's icy fingers brushed Bran's forehead. The connection was instant. Bran's body convulsed, his eyes wide with shock as the Night King's essence flowed into him, a dark symbiosis. The power of the three-eyed raven, the ancient knowledge of the weirwoods, the secrets of time itself all now belonged to the Night King. Jon screamed, a primal sound of grief and fury, as he watched Bran's transformation unfold. But there was nothing he could do. His sword felt like a meaningless piece of steel against this force of death and magic. The Night King, now within Bran's body, turned to face Jon, a cruel flicker of something akin to amusement in his eyes. He raised his hand, and the dead answered. Arya's body was the first to rise, her vacant eyes now filled with the cold, blue light of the undead. Jon stumbled back, horror flooding his veins as he saw his sister, no, the creature that wore his sister's face, stand alongside the army of the dead. "Run," came a voice from the trees. Daenerys Targaryen descended on Drogon, her face pale but determined. "We must fall back." Jon hesitated, his eyes locked on Arya, on Bran, or what was left of them. But there was no time to mourn. No time to fight. Only time to survive. Reluctantly, Jon turned and mounted Regal, the dragon's powerful wings lifting him and Daenerys into the night sky. Below them, the dead marched. The north had fallen, Winterfell swallowed by the advancing tide of ice and death. The remnants of their forces regrouped at Dragonstone, battered and broken. The halls of the ancient fortress were cold and empty, echoing with the footsteps of the few survivors who had managed to escape the onslaught. The reality of their situation began to sink in. Arya was dead, Bran was lost, and the Night King now commanded powers beyond their comprehension. Daenerys stood at the edge of the cliffs, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sea below was churning, the winds colder than they should have been this early in the season. "He will come for us," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crash of the waves. Jon stood beside her, his face as grim as the sky. "He has the dragons now," he said, the words heavy in his throat. TWO against ONE, it was barely a fight before. Now he has all three. Daenerys clenched her fists, her knuckles white. "We can't defeat him. Not like this." Her voice trembled with a rare vulnerability, but she quickly steeled herself. She was a queen, the queen. There had to be a way. Jon looked out at the sea, his heart weighed down by the enormity of their defeat. "We'll have to find one." As the cold winds swept across Dragonstone, they both knew this was no longer a battle for the throne. It was a battle for survival. And the Night King was coming. With the power of the three-eyed raven at his command and 3 undead dragons in his wake, he would not stop until all of Westeros was buried beneath the ice. Chapter 2, The Rise of the Three Dragons would continue with the aftermath, as Jon and Daenerys prepare for the inevitable clash, while the Night King grows more unstoppable with every passing moment. The winter had truly come, and with it, death marched on King's Landing. Chapter 2, The Rise of the Three Dragons. The chill in the air at Dragonstone was a reminder of the doom that crept ever closer. The fires in the castle's hearths burned brightly, but they did little to fight the cold settling into the bones of those who gathered within its walls. Outside, the waves crashed angrily against the rocky cliffs, their roar echoing the tension that hung in the air. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen stood at the war table, a map of Westeros spread out before them. The flames from the hearth flickered, casting shadows across the room, but none of the warmth could ease the dread gnawing at their hearts. The news had arrived just before dawn. Arya Stark was dead, Bran Stark was no more, and the Night King now had control of 3 dragons. 3 dragons. Daenerys stared down at the map, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had once ruled the skies with her dragons, her children. Now, they belonged to death. 3 dragons. She repeated, her voice low and cold. He controls them all now. Jon stood beside her, his face grim. The weight of their losses hung heavy between them, but there was no time to grieve. Winter was coming, not just the season, but the death that followed the Night King. "If he attacks Dragonstone with all 3, Jon began, but Daenerys cut him off. "He will attack," she said, her eyes flashing with a fury barely contained beneath the surface. "It's only a matter of time." Varys, who had been standing in the corner, stepped forward. His face was pale, and for the first time in a long while, the spider looked genuinely afraid. "We have no defense against dragons. The Night King's power grows with every day that passes, and with Bran's abilities added to his. We will fight," Daenerys said firmly. "We must." The silence that followed was thick, each person in the room weighed down by the reality of what was to come. Jon, however, kept his gaze on Daenerys. He could see the toll the loss had taken on her. The dragons were not just tools of war to her, they were family. And now, they were turned against her. Before anyone could speak, a cold gust of wind blew through the chamber. Grey Worm, flanked by 2 Unsullied, entered, his expression as unreadable as ever, but even he seemed more tense than usual. "Scouts report movement in the north," he said. "The dead, they march." A shiver ran down Jon's spine. The dead were always marching, relentless, unstoppable, and now they came with the power of dragons. He looked to Daenerys, but her gaze remained fixed on the map. "The narrow sea will not protect us for long," she said quietly, more to herself than to the others. "The Night King can fly. How long do we have?" Jon asked. "Not long," Grey Worm replied. "Days. Perhaps less." The night fell heavy and cold over Dragonstone. The wind screamed through the castle walls, and even the dragons, Regal and Drogon, were restless. Their deep, rumbling growls echoed in the courtyard as they paced, sensing the storm that was coming. Daenerys stood on the battlements, the wind whipping her silver hair around her face as she stared out at the darkened sea. She knew the Night King would come soon. She had always known that her battle for the throne would cost her dearly, but never had she imagined she would face such an enemy who could not be bargained with, who could not be reasoned with. A heavy hand on her shoulder pulled her from her thoughts. Jon stood beside her, his face stern and his eyes filled with the weight of all they had lost. "We've fought impossible odds before," he said, his voice soft but determined. "We'll do it again." Daenerys turned to him, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and sorrow. "This is different, Jon. He's not just a man we can kill. He's death itself. He has dragons." Jon said nothing, but his silence was filled with understanding. He had seen the Night King's power firsthand, and the thought of facing him now, with the combined strength of 3 dragons and Bran Stark's knowledge, was terrifying. "We still have Regal and Drogon," Jon said, trying to hold on to some sliver of hope. "They'll fight for you." Daenerys nodded, but the weight of it all was heavy. 2 against 3. The odds were not in their favor. Suddenly, a low, mournful sound echoed in the distance, cutting through the wind. Daenerys and Jon turned toward the sky, their eyes scanning the horizon. The night was thick with clouds, but something moved in the darkness, something massive. Drogon and Regal roared, their voices reverberating through the castle, and Daenerys felt it, an icy chill creeping into her bones. "They're here," Jon whispered, his breath visible in the freezing air. High above the clouds, the Night King soared on the back of Viserion, the once proud dragon that had been brought back to life in his service. His eyes burned blue, colder than the frost that trailed in their wake. Below, a legion of the dead marched, their lifeless eyes fixed on Dragonstone. The Night King did not speak, did not need to command his forces aloud. His will alone was enough to drive them forward, to move the undead army like a single, unrelenting tide. And with Bran's abilities, his understanding of time and the world's magic, the Night King's control had only deepened. But it was the dragons that truly made him unstoppable. With a thought, he called to the 2 remaining creatures, Regal and Drogon. He would break them, as he had broken Viserion. And once they were his, nothing would stand in his way. Back on Dragonstone, the alarm sounded. Grey Worm and the Unsullied rushed to their positions, readying themselves for the battle to come. Jon and Daenerys climbed atop their dragons, hearts pounding as they prepared to face the inevitable. "I'll take Regal," Jon said, looking to Daenerys with grim determination. She nodded, though her heart ached at the thought. Regal was a connection to her lost brother, and now, it might be all that stood between them and the end. Drogon's powerful wings beat against the air as Daenerys took to the skies, Jon following on Regal's back. Below, the dead began to emerge from the darkness, a tide of ice and death marching toward the castle. And in the distance, like a black storm on the horizon, the Night King appeared, Viserion at his side. The clash of fire and ice was deafening. Drogon roared as he met Viserion in the sky, the 2 massive creatures colliding in a fury of flames and frozen breath. Below, Jon struggled to maintain control of Regal as the dead closed in on the castle, their sheer numbers overwhelming the unsullied forces. But the true terror came not from the battle below, but from the sky above. Viserion was stronger than before, more vicious, more powerful. His icy breath froze everything it touched, and Drogon was struggling to keep pace. Daenerys screamed in fury as she commanded Drogon to unleash a torrent of flame, but Viserion was faster, dodging the blast with unnatural speed. The Night King watched with cold satisfaction as his creation outmaneuvered Daenerys' most powerful weapon. And then, with a single, chilling command, he summoned Regal to his side. Jon felt it, the pull, the unnatural connection that the Night King had over the creatures of the living and the dead. Regal roared in defiance, but the control was slipping. Jon's heart sank as he realized the truth: they were losing the battle. And once the dragons were lost, Westeros would fall. Chapter 3: The Fall of Dragonstone. The storm had settled over Dragonstone, a harbinger of the death to come. Waves crashed violently against the cliffs, and the howling wind carried the icy breath of winter, sweeping through the castle's narrow halls. The shadow of doom loomed as Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen prepared for what felt like their final stand. The bitter taste of defeat from the last battle still lingered in their hearts. Viserion, the dragon that had once been Daenerys' child, was now an instrument of death in the hands of the Night King. With each day that passed, their enemy grew stronger, while their forces dwindled. Jon stood in the courtyard, watching the unsullied soldiers line up in their ranks, stoic despite the cold. They were brave, but no amount of bravery could stop what was coming. He clenched his fists, the weight of his leadership bearing down on him as he thought of the people they had failed, the ones who were already lost. Arya, Bran. The names haunted him. Nearby, Daenerys paced like a caged lioness. Drogon, towering over her, growled softly, his eyes following her every move. Regal, still loyal to Jon, was less animated, his wings twitching as if sensing the approach of something unnatural. The tension in the air was thick, the atmosphere filled with the unspoken truth that they might not survive this battle. But survival was not the only goal. They needed to make their stand here, to delay the inevitable as long as possible. Inside the Great Hall, Tyrion Lannister, Varys, and Grey Worm discussed strategies in hushed voices. Their plans had grown desperate. The weight of the coming assault seemed to sap the room of hope. Tyrion, ever the realist, leaned over the map, his eyes narrowed as if he could see a way to victory buried within the parchment. "We need to hold the line as long as we can. The longer we keep the Night King here, the more time we buy for the rest of Westeros." Varys shook his head. "Time won't matter if we all die here, Tyrion. And with the dragons under his control, it may only take a few hours before Dragonstone falls." Grey Worm, standing at attention, added with grim resolve, "We will hold as long as possible." The door swung open, and Jon and Daenerys entered the hall, their expressions mirroring the hopelessness of the conversation they had interrupted. Jon's voice broke the silence. "They're coming." As the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness swallowed Dragonstone. The night brought with it a bone-chilling cold, a frost that crept into every crack and crevice of the ancient fortress. Fires burned brightly in the hearths, but their warmth was fleeting against the unnatural winter that pressed in from all sides. From the ramparts, Jon watched the sky, his breath visible in the frigid air. In the distance, a sound that chilled him to his core echoed through the night, the eerie screech of a dragon. It was not Drogon, nor Regal. It was Viserion, the creature of ice and death, and it was drawing closer. "Jon," Daenerys said, approaching him from behind. She wore her battle armor, silver and black, her face set in a mask of cold determination. He turned to her, his brow furrowed with worry. "He'll be here soon. We have to be ready." "I know," she replied, her voice softer than usual. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared responsibility pressing down on them. Then, Daenerys spoke again, her voice tinged with sorrow. I failed them, Jon. I failed my children. I couldn't protect them. Jon placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with the same pain she carried. This isn't your fault, Daenerys. The Night King is unlike any enemy we've faced. We couldn't have known what would happen. But now we know, she said, her tone hardening. And we have to stop him. Jon nodded, but as he looked out into the darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. We'll do what we can, but if we don't, Daenerys interrupted, her voice resolute, then Westeros is lost. The battle began as expected, brutally, and without mercy. The dead came first, their hollow eyes glowing with the unnatural blue of the Night King's control. They swarmed the beach in waves, clawing their way up the cliffs of Dragonstone, driven by a hunger that could never be sated. The Unsullied met them head-on, their discipline and skill unmatched, but even they could only hold the line for so long. Above, the sky was filled with the thunderous roars of dragons. Drogon and Rhaegal soared into the air, their mighty wings beating against the freezing wind as they met Viserion in a clash of flame and frost. Daenerys guided Drogon with fury in her heart, his fire lighting up the night as he unleashed torrents of flame at his undead brother. Viserion, though, was faster than before, more agile in his icy form. He dodged Drogon's attacks with unnatural ease, his breath freezing everything in its path. Rhaegal joined the fray, diving at Viserion with claws extended, but even together, the two living dragons struggled against the might of the undead beast. The Night King rode upon Viserion's back, his face an emotionless mask as he directed the dragon with cold precision. With a single, deadly gesture, he commanded Viserion to strike, and the undead dragon unleashed a blast of freezing breath that collided with Rhaegal's fiery attack. The sky exploded in a storm of ice and fire. On the ground, Jon fought alongside Grey Worm and the remaining forces, their weapons barely holding back the tide of the dead. He swung Longclaw with every ounce of strength he had, cutting through the wights that surrounded him, but for every one he killed, two more took its place. We can't hold them, Grey Worm shouted, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. Jon knew he was right. The dead were too many. They were being overwhelmed. Then, from the sky, came the terrible sound of cracking ice. Jon looked up just in time to see Rhaegal falter, one of his wings frozen solid by Viserion's breath. The great dragon roared in pain as he struggled to stay aloft, but the damage was too great. With a final, heart-wrenching cry, Rhaegal plummeted from the sky, crashing into the rocky cliffs below. No! Jon's scream tore from his throat as he watched the dragon, his dragon, fall to its death. Desperation surged through him as he turned back to the battle, his rage fueling his every strike. But it wasn't enough. Daenerys saw Rhaegal fall, her heart shattering at the sight. But there was no time to mourn. Viserion was still coming for them, and the Night King was relentless. She urged Drogon higher, trying to gain the advantage, but Viserion was always just one step ahead. With a sudden, terrifying speed, Viserion surged forward, his jaws snapping at Drogon's throat. Daenerys screamed as Drogon twisted in the air, narrowly avoiding the attack, but Viserion's icy breath followed, freezing the tips of Drogon's wings and slowing his flight. The Night King's cold, emotionless gaze locked onto Daenerys. She could feel his power, the suffocating chill of death that radiated from him, and for the first time, she felt true fear. But she couldn't give up. Not yet. With a roar of defiance, Drogon unleashed a final burst of flame, his fire hotter and brighter than ever before. It struck Viserion full force, engulfing the undead dragon in a blaze of fiery destruction. For a moment, it seemed as though the fire would win, that Viserion would be consumed by the heat. But then, through the flames, came the piercing blue glow of Viserion's eyes. The fire had done nothing. Dragonstone was falling. The dead overran the castle, their icy touch spreading like a plague. The Unsullied fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. Jon fought his way to the castle's gates, but it was clear that there was no hope of victory here. "Retreat," he shouted, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Fall back." Grey Worm and the remaining soldiers began to pull back, retreating into the castle as the dead swarmed the walls. But even inside the castle, they were not safe. The dead followed, their relentless advance pushing Jon and the others deeper into the fortress. Above, Daenerys and Drogon continued their desperate battle against Viserion, but the tide had turned. The Night King was winning. With a final, shattering roar, Viserion struck. His icy breath engulfed Drogon's wing, freezing it solid. Drogon screamed in agony as his massive body plummeted toward the ground, Daenerys clinging desperately to his back. They crashed into the courtyard with a thunderous impact, the ground shaking beneath them. Daenerys was thrown from Drogon's back, landing hard against the stone. She struggled to her feet, her body aching from the fall, but when she looked up, her heart sank. The Night King stood before her, his cold, blue eyes locked onto hers. It was over. In the end, Dragonstone fell. The dead claimed the castle, and the Night King stood victorious. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen had fought bravely, but even their combined strength had not been enough to stop the tide of death. The army of the dead was unstoppable, and now, with Dragonstone under the Night King's control, there was nothing left to stand in his way. Winter had truly come, and with it, the end of the living. Chapter 4: The March on King's Landing. The cold winds of winter swept across the land, carrying with it the whispers of death and destruction. The once fertile fields of the Riverlands were now barren, coated with a layer of frost that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Night King, now in Bran Stark's body, led his army of the dead southward with a merciless, unrelenting pace. Behind him, the sky was darkened by the ominous presence of 3 dragons, Viserion, now an icy shell of the beast he once was, alongside Drogon and Rhaegal, both twisted into undead monstrosities under the Night King's control. Every village they passed fell to the ice and silence. The living fled or were consumed by the whites, joining the ranks of the undead. The ground froze under the Night King's march, turning green pastures into wastelands, rivers into solid ice. Nothing could stop him. Far ahead, perched atop the cliffs of Blackwater Bay, lay King's Landing. The largest city in Westeros, it bustled with life, but that life was now tinged with the unmistakable taste of fear. The cold had come, and with it, the knowledge that death was marching toward them. In the Red Keep, Queen Cersei Lannister stood at the window of her chambers, watching the distant horizon with a steely gaze. She knew what was coming, but in her heart, she refused to believe it could end this way. Her loyal hand, Qyburn, stood by her side. "Your Grace, the reports from the Riverlands are grim. The dead advance with every passing day. Our scouts say they are no more than a week away." Cersei did not flinch. "Let them come. I will not flee. The walls of King's Landing have stood for centuries, and they will hold against this army of corpses." Qyburn hesitated, his voice lowering as he spoke. "This is no ordinary army, Your Grace. The dead, they do not fear, they do not tire. And the dragons." "Enough," Cersei snapped, turning to face him with fury in her eyes. "I have the Golden Company at my command, the might of the Lannisters, and the best defenses in the realm. I will not cower in fear like a beaten dog." But even as she spoke, the truth gnawed at her. The dead had already defeated the North. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen, who had once been her greatest threats, had fallen, and now their defeat seemed inevitable. For the first time in her reign, Cersei felt a pang of uncertainty. In the streets of King's Landing, the tension was palpable. Word had spread of the Night King's approach, and the city's inhabitants were gripped with a fear they had never known. Mothers clutched their children, and traders sold their wares at desperate prices, knowing that gold would soon be worthless. Tyrion Lannister moved through the streets with Jaime at his side. The city's panic mirrored his own. They had lost everything at Dragonstone. Jon, Daenerys, their armies, it had all been for nothing. Now, The only thing that stood between the living and the dead was the crumbling alliances of the south. Jaime glanced at his brother, his golden hand glinting in the dim light. "Do you think she'll listen?" Tyrion shook his head, his expression grim. "No. Cersei doesn't listen to reason, not even now. But we have to try. She has to understand that the dead don't care about thrones or crowns. If we don't stand together, we'll all die." As they approached the Red Keep, Tyrion's mind raced with thoughts of how they could possibly persuade Cersei to unite with what remained of the living forces. He knew his sister too well, her pride, her ambition, her paranoia. She would not bend easily. Inside the throne room, Jaime and Tyrion stood before Cersei, the atmosphere heavy with tension. She sat upon the Iron Throne, her face expressionless as she listened to their pleas. Behind her, the ominous figure of Gregor Clegane loomed, a reminder of the brutality she could unleash at any moment. "You expect me to join forces with the Starks and the Targaryens, after everything?" Cersei scoffed, her voice dripping with contempt. "They're gone, Cersei," Tyrion said, stepping forward, his voice earnest. "Daenerys, Jon. They're either dead or worse. The North has fallen. The Night King is coming for you next." Jaime nodded, his voice steady but urgent. "If you don't help, we won't just lose the throne, we'll lose everything. Everyone." Cersei's gaze flickered between her brothers, her expression unreadable. "And what would you have me do? Open the gates? Hand over my army to be slaughtered by corpses?" "No," Tyrion replied, his eyes pleading. "We fight together. The Golden Company, the Lannisters, whatever forces remain. It's our only chance." For a long moment, silence filled the room. Cersei stared at them, her eyes cold, calculating. Then, finally, she spoke. "I will not sacrifice my army for the North's mistakes. If the dead come, we will fight them on our terms, behind our walls. But I will not join forces with the fools who caused this mess." Tyrion's heart sank. He had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed was still a bitter blow. Jaime's jaw clenched in frustration, but he remained silent, knowing that further argument would be futile. As the days passed, the cold in King's Landing deepened. Frost began to form on the rooftops, and the harbor froze, trapping ships in the ice. The people could feel the approach of the dead, even if they couldn't see them yet. The sense of dread hung over the city like a dark cloud. Within the Red Keep, preparations were underway for the inevitable battle. The Golden Company drilled tirelessly, and the Lannister soldiers fortified the city's walls. But no one could shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. In the shadows, Qyburn worked on something far more sinister. Hidden deep within the bowels of the Red Keep, he oversaw a project that he believed might turn the tide of the war. A weapon, born of fire and shadow, one that could rival even the Night King's dragons. But it was a gamble, and even Qyburn wasn't certain it would work. On the outskirts of the city, as the first scouts reported the arrival of the dead, panic set in. Refugees from the countryside poured into King's Landing, their faces hollow with fear. The gates were shut, but the whispers of doom grew louder. Jaime stood atop the battlements, watching as the sky to the north darkened. The cold had grown unbearable, and the wind carried with it the unmistakable stench of decay. He knew that the Night King was near. Beside him, Tyrion stared into the distance, his mind racing with thoughts of how they could possibly survive the coming onslaught. "We're not ready," he muttered, more to himself than to Jaime. "We never were," Jaime replied, his voice grim. "But we have to hold. For as long as we can." In the distance, the first whites appeared on the horizon, their pale forms moving in unison like a swarm of locusts. Behind them, the towering silhouettes of the Night King's dragons blotted out the sky. The ground beneath their feet froze with each step, and the icy wind howled as if heralding the end of days. In the Red Keep, Cersei stood at the window, watching the army of the dead approach. Her expression was cold, defiant, but inside, she could feel the fear creeping in. She turned to Qyburn, who stood at her side. "Is it ready?" she asked, her voice betraying none of her inner turmoil. Qyburn nodded. "Yes, Your Grace. But it is untested. We cannot know for certain if it will." "It will work," Cersei interrupted, her voice firm. "It has to." As the bells of King's Landing tolled, signaling the approach of the dead, Cersei Lannister steeled herself for the fight to come. She would not bend. She would not break. The Iron Throne was hers, and she would hold it, even if it meant facing the army of the dead alone. But as the cold winds of winter howled through the streets, even Cersei knew that this battle would be unlike any she had ever faced. The dead had come for King's Landing, and with them, they brought the end of the living world. Winter had arrived, and it was unstoppable. Chapter 5: The Last Stand of the Living. The frigid winds howled over King's Landing as the air turned sharp and cold. The city was no longer the warm, bustling heart of the Seven Kingdoms but a fortress on the brink of despair. Refugees from the Riverlands and Crownlands crammed the streets, seeking shelter within the capital's walls. Some huddled together near fires, others muttered prayers to the gods, old and new, but all carried the same haunted look in their eyes. Winter had come, and with it, the dead. Jaime Lannister stood atop the battlements of the Red Keep, looking out over the city. The gates had been shut for days, and the once bustling harbor now lay frozen, trapping ships in the bay. The sky had darkened with the constant, swirling snow, and the sun seemed only a distant memory. In the distance, the faint outline of the dead army appeared like a dark, ominous wave, slowly rolling toward the city. "They'll be here soon," Jaime muttered, his breath visible in the cold air. His golden hand clenched the hilt of his sword. He had fought countless battles, but nothing had ever felt like this, a battle that felt more like a funeral march. Tyrion stood beside him, equally grim. "Cersei won't yield. Even with everything at stake, she refuses to see reason." "That's not new," Jaime replied with a bitter chuckle. "She's convinced that the walls of King's Landing will hold. But we both know this city wasn't built to withstand the dead." Tyrion turned to his brother, his brow furrowed with concern. "We need every sword, Jaime. If Cersei won't unite with the living, we're doomed." Jaime's jaw tightened. He had tried, more than once, to convince Cersei that the threat was greater than any crown or throne. But she was stubborn, blinded by her ambition. Even as the dead marched closer, she clung to the Iron Throne as if it was the only thing that mattered. "I'll talk to her again," Jaime said quietly, though he knew it was likely in vain. In the throne room of the Red Keep, Cersei sat upon the Iron Throne, her gaze fixed on the map of Westeros painted on the floor. She traced the lines of her kingdom with her eyes, but the cold reality of her situation crept closer with each passing hour. Qyburn stood at her side, ever the loyal advisor. "The dead will arrive by nightfall, Your Grace," he said, his voice low but steady. "Our scouts have confirmed it." Cersei remained silent for a moment, her fingers tapping against the armrest of the throne. "And the weapon? Is it ready?" Qyburn hesitated for a moment. "It is, Your Grace. But it has not been tested. We do not know if it will be enough to turn the tide." "It will work," Cersei said, her voice firm, though a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "It must work." Just then, Jaime entered the throne room, his footsteps echoing on the cold stone floor. He approached the throne with a sense of urgency. "Cersei, this is madness. You know what's coming. We can't fight this alone." Cersei's gaze hardened as she looked at her brother. "I will not kneel to anyone, Jaime. Not to Daenerys, not to Jon Snow, and certainly not to the dead. This is my kingdom, and I will defend it." Jaime stepped closer, his voice rising with desperation. "This isn't about the throne anymore. The dead won't stop at King's Landing. They'll kill us all, Cersei. We need to unite with what's left of the living. It's our only chance." Cersei stood, her face twisted with anger. Unite with who? The Targaryen queen who came to burn this city? The bastard who betrayed me? No, Jaime. I will not bend. Jaime's eyes flickered with frustration. This isn't about them. This is about survival. If we don't stand together, there won't be a kingdom left to rule. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension between the two siblings palpable. Then, Cersei's lips curled into a cold smile. You've always been weak, Jaime. You let your emotions cloud your judgment. I will not make that mistake. Jaime stared at her, realizing then that nothing he said would change her mind. Cersei was beyond reason, beyond hope. He turned on his heel and left the throne room, his heart heavy with the weight of the coming battle. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the dead arrived at the gates of King's Landing. The Whites, a horde of decaying, lifeless bodies, swarmed the fields outside the city, their eyes glowing with unnatural light. Above them, the 3 dragons of the Night King circled the sky, their icy breath freezing the very air around them. From the battlements, Jaime watched in horror as the first wave of the dead approached the city. The Golden Company had formed ranks at the gates, but even their discipline and numbers seemed insignificant against the endless tide of whites. Beside him, Tyrion stared out at the approaching doom. So this is how it ends, he muttered, his voice heavy with dread. Not with a fight for the throne, but a fight for survival. Jaime drew his sword, the Valyrian steel blade gleaming in the dying light. If we go down fighting. The gates of King's Landing trembled as the dead crashed against them. The city's defenders launched volleys of arrows and scorpion bolts, but the whites were relentless, swarming over the walls like ants. The Golden Company fought bravely, their swords cutting down the dead with precision, but for every white they killed, 2 more took its place. In the chaos, Jaime fought alongside his men, cutting through the dead with brutal efficiency. But it was a losing battle. The dead were too many, and the living too few. For every inch of ground they gained, the dead took it back with cold, unfeeling persistence. Above the battlefield, the Night King's dragons descended upon the city. Their icy breath froze the walls of King's Landing, turning stone to brittle ice. With each pass, more of the city was engulfed in freezing winds and shattered masonry. Inside the Red Keep, Cersei watched the battle unfold from her window. She had expected a siege, but this was a massacre. The dead were overwhelming her forces, and even the might of the Golden Company seemed like little more than a speed bump in the Night King's advance. Qyburn approached her cautiously. "Your Grace, we must consider a retreat." "The city." "Silence," Cersei snapped, her eyes fixed on the chaos below. "We fight. We hold." But even as she spoke, she knew the truth. The city would not hold. The dead would not stop. And soon, they would be at her gates. In the heart of the battle, Jaime fought with everything he had. His sword cut through whites with practiced skill, but the tide was unrelenting. He looked up to see one of the Night King's dragons swoop low, its icy breath freezing entire squads of soldiers where they stood. "We can't hold them," a soldier screamed as the dead surged forward, breaking through the outer defenses. Tyrion, blooded and weary, fought his way to Jaime's side. "We have to fall back to the Red Keep. It's our only chance." Jaime nodded grimly, knowing that it was a desperate move. The Red Keep was their final refuge, and even it would not hold for long. As the last of the Golden Company retreated into the city, Jaime and Tyrion led the remaining forces toward the Red Keep. The dead followed, relentless in their pursuit. In the skies above, the Night King watched from the back of Viserion, his icy blue eyes fixed on the city below. As the gates of the Red Keep slammed shut, Jaime turned to Tyrion, his face grim. "This is it. We make our last stand here." Tyrion nodded, his expression equally somber. "For better or worse, this is where it ends." And as the dead surrounded the Red Keep, the last survivors of King's Landing prepared for the final battle. The walls shook with the weight of the dead's assault, and the dragons of the Night King circled overhead, their frozen breath promising death to all who stood against them. Winter had come to King's Landing, and with it, the last stand of the living. Chapter 6: The Night of Fire and Ice. The skies over King's Landing were thick with swirling snow and dark clouds, the air freezing to the bone. The city was plunged into chaos as the final battle loomed. Inside the Red Keep, the tension was palpable. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen, blooded and weary from their earlier battles, stood side by side in the throne room, their eyes locked on the distant horizon. "We're out of time," Jon said, his voice grim. He was wrapped in layers of fur, but the cold still pierced through. "The Night King is here." Daenerys nodded, her silver hair wild from the icy winds. She looked older, hardened by the loss of her dragons and the people she had sworn to protect. "Then we fight with what we have left," she said, her tone resolute. The last remaining forces of the living soldiers from what remained of the North, unsullied, and a few scattered Lannister loyalists were gathered in the Red Keep, preparing for what they all knew would be their final stand. The dead had breached the outer defenses of King's Landing, and the sound of their mindless wails echoed throughout the city. Tyrion stood near a massive table, poring over a map of King's Landing with Jaime at his side. "We've lost the gates," Tyrion said, his voice low but steady. "It's only a matter of time before they're inside." Jaime clenched his jaw, his golden hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "We hold them as long as we can. Every second we delay gives us another chance to take down the Night King." A chill ran through the room as the massive stone doors creaked open. Brienne of Tarth entered, her armor covered in frost, her face pale with exhaustion. "The dead are at the walls of the keep," she said, her voice steady despite the despair etched on her features. "It won't be long." Daenerys took a deep breath and turned to Jon. "I will fly Drogon one last time. We have to take the fight to the Night King." Jon's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "If you go up there alone." "I won't be alone," she interrupted. "I still have one dragon. And I still have you." Jon hesitated, knowing that their chances were slim, but he nodded. "I'll lead the ground assault. We'll fight them in the streets, and you bring down the Night King from the skies." Daenerys offered him a faint smile, the fire in her eyes not yet extinguished. "For the living," she whispered. "For the living," Jon echoed. The streets of King's Landing had become a frozen wasteland. The dead poured through the city like a tidal wave, their icy breath freezing everything they touched. Whites, pale and lifeless, swarmed the streets, and the screams of the few remaining citizens filled the air. Jon Snow led the remnants of the living through the narrow alleys of the city, engaging the dead in brutal, close-quarters combat. His Valyrian steel sword, Longclaw, sliced through the whites with deadly precision, but for every one he cut down, more seemed to rise in their place. "Push them back," Jon shouted, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. "We have to hold this line." The Northerners fought valiantly beside him, their swords and axes cleaving through the dead with fierce determination. Grey Worm and the Unsullied fought with flawless discipline, their spears striking like lightning, but the dead kept coming, relentless and unyielding. Above the chaos, the sky darkened even further as the Night King descended upon King's Landing. He rode atop Viserion, the once mighty dragon now a twisted creature of ice and death. His blue eyes glowed with cold malice, and his presence seemed to drain the warmth from the air itself. Daenerys soared into the sky atop Drogon, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of everything she had lost, her home, her people, her dragons, but now was not the time for mourning. Now was the time to strike. With a sharp command, Drogon dove toward the Night King. The massive black dragon let out a roar that shook the heavens, and flames erupted from his maw, aimed directly at Viserion. The two dragons clashed in midair, fire and ice colliding in a brilliant explosion of light and power. The Night King remained eerily calm, his icy grip on Viserion unshaken. With a wave of his hand, he directed Viserion to strike back. The ice dragon let out a bone-chilling scream, and a blast of frozen breath shot toward Drogon. The fire and ice met in the air, the shockwave shaking the very foundations of the city below. Daenerys held on tightly as Drogon dodged the attack and circled around, his fiery breath lighting up the night. She could see the Night King watching her, his gaze cold and calculating. This was no ordinary enemy. He was death incarnate, and he would not be easily defeated. On the ground, Jon fought his way through the chaos, his eyes constantly scanning the skies for any sign of the Night King. The Whites swarmed around him, their lifeless hands grasping for his throat, but he fought on, cutting through them with desperation and fury. "Jon," a voice shouted from nearby. He turned to see Jaime Lannister fighting his way toward him, his golden hand gleaming in the dim light. "We can't hold them much longer," Jon nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We just need to buy her time." But even as he said it, the dead seemed endless. The streets of King's Landing were overrun, and the living were being pushed back toward the Red Keep. Grey Worm led the Unsullied in a last-ditch effort to form a defensive line, but the weight of the dead was too much. Jaime's sword flashed as he cut down another White, his eyes wild with determination. "If we're going to die, let's die fighting." Jon could only nod in agreement. They had no other choice. High above the city, Daenerys unleashed another torrent of flames from Drogon's Maw, but the Night King remained unscathed. His icy power seemed to deflect the fire, and as Viserion surged forward, Daenerys felt a jolt of fear. This wasn't working. With a cry of frustration, she urged Drogon to dive once more. This time, she aimed not at the Night King himself, but at the ground below. The dragon's fire tore through the ranks of the dead, incinerating Whites by the dozens. But still, it wasn't enough. The Night King raised his hand, and with a single gesture, the dead began to rise again. Those that had fallen in the flames stood once more, their eyes glowing with the eerie light of the Night King's control. Daenerys' heart sank. She had seen this before, at Winterfell, and now it was happening again. Every time they killed the dead, they only rose stronger. Suddenly, a massive roar echoed across the battlefield, and Drogon let out a pained shriek. The ice dragon Viserion had struck, its frozen breath slamming into Drogon's side. Daenerys was thrown from her saddle, tumbling through the air as Drogon spiraled out of control. The world spun around her as she fell, the cold wind biting at her skin. And then, with a bone-jarring impact, she hit the ground. Jon saw Daenerys fall and his heart lurched. He fought his way through the dead, desperate to reach her. The streets were a maze of ice and fire, and every step felt like a battle for survival. But then, through the chaos, he saw her. Daenerys lay motionless in the snow, her face pale and her body still. Drogon, wounded but alive, hovered protectively above her, his massive wings creating gusts of wind that sent the Whites flying. Jon reached her side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Daenerys," he shouted, shaking her. Her eyes fluttered open, and she groaned in pain. "Jon, we need to get you out of here," Jon said urgently, his eyes scanning the skies for any sign of the Night King. But it was too late. Above them, the Night King descended on Viserion, his icy gaze fixed on the two of them. Jon stood, his sword raised, but he knew there was no defeating him alone. The Night King dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow. He stepped forward, his gaze cold and unfeeling. Jon clenched his sword tightly, ready to fight to the death. But as the Night King approached, he simply smiled, a cold, chilling smile that froze Jon to the core. Winter had come, and the living had lost. Chapter 7: The Frozen Throne. The sun had not risen over King's Landing for days. A pale light filtered through thick, swirling clouds as the dead filled the streets, their footsteps silent and relentless. Winter had claimed the city, and with it, the last flicker of hope for the living. Daenerys lay in the snow, barely conscious, the cold seeping into her bones. Jon knelt beside her, his face pale with exhaustion and despair. Drogon hovered nearby, injured but standing guard. Above them, the Night King, still wearing the face of Bran Stark, stood victorious, the embodiment of an unstoppable winter. Jon struggled to rise, gripping his sword, Longclaw, though he knew it would do little good. "It's not over yet," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. Daenerys coughed weakly, her eyes fluttering open. "Jon," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "It's over," came a voice from behind them. Tyrion Lannister approached, his face twisted with grief and defeat. He stood at the foot of the Red Keep, now half buried in snow and ice, the once mighty castle now a crumbling ruin. Behind him, a few scattered survivors, what remained of the North, the Unsullied, and the people of King's Landing, huddled together, waiting for the end. "There's no one left to fight," Tyrion said, his breath fogging the air. "No one left to save." Jon looked up at the Night King, standing motionless atop the steps of the Great Hall. His icy blue eyes scanned the destruction before him, as if savoring the final moments of his victory. Viserion, the ice dragon, perched nearby, its breath freezing the very air it exhaled. The Night King raised his hand slowly, and with a gesture, the dead began to stir once more. Those who had fallen in battle were rising again, their bodies twisted by the cold, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light that filled the Night King's own. "This is it," Jon said, his voice hoarse. "We have to make our stand here." Tyrion gave a grim nod. "One last time, then." The remaining forces of the living gathered before the gates of the Red Keep, a pitifully small group compared to the endless horde of the dead. Jaime Lannister stood among them, his golden hand clenched into a fist. Brienne of Tarth was at his side, her face set in grim determination. Grey Worm, blooded and battered, still stood tall, leading what remained of the Unsullied. "We die here," Jaime said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But we die with honor." Brienne gave him a sidelong glance. "No one's dying yet, Jaime. Not if I have anything to say about it." The dead surged forward, their numbers overwhelming. The living clashed with them in one final, desperate fight. The sound of steel meeting flesh, the crack of bones under the weight of sword strikes, and the howls of the dead filled the frozen air. Jon fought furiously, his sword cutting through whites with every swing. But for every one he felled, another rose in its place. He was losing ground, step by step, as the dead closed in. He could see Daenerys struggling to stay conscious, barely holding on as the cold drained the life from her. In the chaos, Drogon roared and unleashed a torrent of flames, incinerating dozens of whites at once. But even the dragon's fire could not turn the tide. Jon knew they were out of time. As if sensing Jon's thoughts, the Night King began to descend the steps of the Red Keep, his eyes fixed on Jon Snow. Each step he took sent ripples of frost across the ground, turning the city into a frozen wasteland. "You can't defeat him," Tyrion whispered from Jon's side, his eyes wide with fear. "Not like this." But Jon refused to give up. "There's always a way," he said through gritted teeth. "We just need to find it." The Night King drew closer, and Jon raised Longclaw, ready to face him head-on. But before he could move, a blinding light pierced the dark sky. Suddenly, Drogon roared again, more fiercely than ever. From the clouds above, a burst of fire erupted. Daenerys, summoning her last strength, raised her hand toward the Night King. Drogon, wounded but determined, soared into the sky once more, unleashing his final attack, a torrent of fire aimed directly at the Night King. The flames enveloped the Night King, turning the air around him into a blazing inferno. Jon shielded his eyes from the heat, his heart pounding. For a moment, it seemed like they had succeeded, that fire had finally destroyed the icy tyrant. But when the flames died down, the Night King stood unharmed, his cold smile unbroken. The fire had left no mark. Jon's heart sank. With one final, deliberate motion, the Night King raised his hand. Jon barely had time to react. In a flash, an icy spear materialized in the Night King's grasp, and with a single, swift throw, the spear struck Drogon in the chest. The great dragon let out one final, earth-shaking roar before crashing to the ground, lifeless. "No!" Daenerys screamed, her voice filled with anguish. She collapsed to her knees, her strength gone. Jon rushed to her side, but it was too late. The Night King's army was closing in, and there was nothing left to stop them. The Night King ascended the steps to the Iron Throne, his icy form towering over the shattered remnants of the once great kingdom. He stood before the throne for a moment, studying it as if deciding whether it was worthy of him. And then, with a single touch of his hand, the Iron Throne froze solid, transforming into a monument of ice. The metal spikes and sharp edges glittered in the dim light, but they were now cold and lifeless, just like the city that surrounded them. The Night King sat upon the frozen throne, his expression impassive as he surveyed the ruin of Westeros. King's Landing had fallen. The realm was his. In the aftermath, the few survivors huddled together, the weight of their defeat crushing them. The world had changed. The living had lost. Tyrion stood among the ruins, his mind numb with shock. "This is how it ends," he whispered. "All of it, gone." Jaime, bleeding from a dozen wounds, sank to his knees beside him. "We failed," he said, his voice breaking. "There's nothing left." Jon held Daenerys in his arms, her breath shallow, her eyes glazed over with pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jon pressed his forehead to hers, his own tears freezing on his cheeks. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said, his voice cracking with sorrow. As the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ruined city, the last remnants of warmth faded from the world. The Night King's reign had begun, and with it came an endless winter. Westeros was frozen, and there was no one left to fight for its future. The frozen throne now stood as a symbol of the dead's victory, and the long night had begun. Don't let the shadows of Westeros fade too quickly. If you enjoyed this tale of icy doom and epic battles, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support keeps the stories coming and ensures you won't miss any of our thrilling adventures. Join our community and be the first to explore new worlds of fantasy and darkness. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep the fire of imagination burning bright. Until next time, keep your lanterns lit and your hearts brave.